Thanks, Jay. So in Ismael Omar Guelleh became the president of Djibouti in 1999. And at this time, he instigated measures that indicated the country was headed in a democratic direction. However, this was short-lived, and the country saw an increasing use of heavy-handed tactics to repress dissent. This authoritarian shift drew little, if any, censure from Western governments. The presentation that Steph and I are going to give today examines evidence of democratic contestation demonstrated in several arenas: electoral arena, the legislature, the judiciary, the media, and civil society. And what we argue is that the Guelleh regime has never met the minimal requirements of a modern democracy and has, in fact, over the years become fully authoritarian. We're also going to discuss how and why Western countries have overlooked Djibouti's democratic shortcomings. We maintain that it is in large part due to the small nation's geostrategic importance, as well as its increasingly diverse investment from outside actors. In this way, Guelleh tactically avoids being beholden to political conditions of any one country.
Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to do in this presentation. So the first thing we're going to do is give you a brief background to Djibouti, so sort of an introduction to the geographic and demographic landscape. We thought this was important because you don't often hear a lot about Djibouti sort of in academic or policy circles. And then in the second bit, we're going to introduce a bit of the democratic theory. So what it's doing to look at different types of regime form, and we're going to introduce the particular lens that we use as our theoretical framework, which is the competitive authoritarian lens. In the third section, we'll actually unpack the Guelleh regime. So we'll go through the electoral arena, the legislature, the judiciary, the media, and civil society. And we're going to look at what evidence there is of democratic contestation in each of these. Based on this, we build our argument that the Guelleh regime was actually competitive authoritarian from 1999 to 2006. And then you start to see a shift in the regime towards authoritarianism, and by 2011, it is fully authoritarian. In the fourth section, we sort of unpack some of the factors that have facilitated this authoritarianism. So looking at foreign military bases, the role of foreign aid and investment. In the final two sections, the first one, we're going to really try and get down into why there hasn't been any Western censure of the same sort that you see in different countries in Africa and elsewhere. And finally, we have a look at how it's going to play out in the future and what the lack of Western censure means for the direction that the government is heading in. Over to you, Claire.
Okay, so to give a little background and context to Djibouti, like Steph said, not a lot of people know about it. Unlike its neighbors, Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti doesn't attract a lot of attention. It's a small country, very small. It's roughly the size of Belgium, and it has a population around 800,000. The majority of people live in the capital, Djibouti City. If any, I don't know how informed the audience is about Djibouti, but it's probably one of the most inhospitable environments there is. The average daily temperature in Djibouti hovers around 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is year-round. With in the summer months, which is about May through August, the mercury rises to around 130 degrees. And it's extremely humid, I might add. The country lacks, obviously, a lot of arable land, and unsurprisingly, the people depend on food imports, which is the country's largest domestic expenditure. It is also one of the least developed countries in the world. Out of 170 countries on the Humanitarian Development Index, Djibouti ranks 165, so pretty close, pretty near the bottom. To give a little background as to the ethnic makeup of the country, the Afar, the major ethnic groups are the Afar and the Isa. And just to give a little clarification, the Isa is actually a clan, a Somali clan. So it's not specifically an ethnic group, but for simplification's sake, we're sort of portraying it that way. The Isa clan constitutes about from 50 to 60% of the population, and it's based largely in the capital. The Afar are related to groups who live in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and they represent about 35 to 40% of the population and are based mainly in the north part of the country. Tensions between these two groups date back to the late colonial period, which was 1967 to 1975. It was a French colony. The French administration favored the Afar in the allocation of government positions, so it favored the minority. In the period since independence, the Afar have been marginalized by the Isa-dominated government, and the regions they inhabit receive very little development. Seth?
So now I'm going to take you through a sort of brief introduction to democratic theory and how we use this in our argument. So the study of democratization really looks at why, how, and when democracies emerge, how they're sustained, and how, why, and when they collapse. Democracy is often thought of being as somewhat synonymous with elections, free and fair elections, having them regularly. With a democratic regime is a regime in which you have regular free and fair elections, and if you don't have that happening, then it's an authoritarian regime. But actually, there's a lot more to democracy than just this. And to find out how democratic a regime really is, you have to look a lot deeper. You have to look at how democratic contestation is fostered through democratic institutions in the inter-election period as well. So the best way to do this is to really look at the role of these different democratic institutions like the legislature, the judiciary, the media, and civil society, and how they hold the regime to account. And how they are used to challenge, and whether in some cases they can actually overthrow the regime. So these are the kind of questions that you're playing with when you really look at the democracy of the regime, I guess. So when you take all of these different factors into account, the distinction between a democracy and a dictatorship becomes a lot less polarized. It's not just that it's one or the other, but you get a whole spectrum of different regimes. And the question then comes up of how do you actually try to classify these different regimes that fall in the grey zone between the two. And you've had a lot of different sort of academics coming out and trying to classify these, like with different regime subtypes that really try and point out different exact things about political institutions and the form they take. So we decided to use one particular regime subtype called competitive authoritarianism, which was developed by Levitsky and Guelleh. And we chose this one because it's one of the few that has a very clear definition and very detailed information about the particular form that each of the democratic institutions takes. So competitive authoritarian regimes are civilian regimes in which democratic institutions exist and permit meaningful competition for power, but where the political playing field is so heavily tilted in favour of the incumbents that the regime cannot be labelled democratic. So yes, very much when you try and examine and classify a regime, you have to look at these different democratic institutions. You need to look at the electoral arena, legislature, judiciary, media, and civil society, and whether they're actually permitting meaningful competition for power. And also how the regime is reacting to this the competition that's coming out of these arenas. And through doing this, you can build quite a detailed view of the regime and how it works. And so that's what we're going to do for the rest of this presentation, is apply this framework to the Guelleh regime in Djibouti. To you, Claire.
Okay, before we get to talking about Guelleh, I want to talk a little bit about who came before Guelleh, and that's Abdon. He was the first president after independence in 1977. So like a lot of African countries, right after independence, Djibouti saw the domination of a single party. And a lot of times what happened in these African countries post-independence was there was only one political party that was legal. So everything else was prohibited. This happened in Tanzania, in a lot of places. So Abdon became the country's first president under a constitution that only permitted an ISA-controlled party called the People's Rally for Progress, RPP. During the 80s, the Afar, so the minority ethnic group, organized a resistance movement against the government, sort of citing repressive techniques and lack of development and funding for these groups. This organization, this Afar organization, the resistance movement, was called the Front for the Restoration of Unity and Democracy. So the acronym is the FRUD. And this group is actually still active, although it's pretty small. But in response to, so a civil war broke out, and in response to the war in the 80s, a new constitution was approved, and it established Djibouti as a multi-party system and permitted the registration of several other political parties. Due to failing health, Abdon stepped down from power in 1999 and was succeeded by Guelleh, who happened to be his nephew. Steph?
Okay, so now we're going to start going through the different arenas of democratic contestation that we mentioned before, starting with the electoral arena. So under the Constitution, the President is elected for 6-year terms and is limited to a maximum of 2 terms. This was the 1992 election. Important, and I'll let you know why in the future. So the parliamentary election, so the way that the parliament is elected is based on quite an unorthodox system, where the whole country is broken down into different constituencies, and the constituency which contains Djibouti actually contains the majority of seats in Djibouti, in the whole parliament. So basically what this system means is that the party can win, a party can win every seat in the parliament with only 55% of the national vote. So another party can come through and win quite a large percent, 45%, and not get 1 seat in the whole parliament. Other major barriers that, in terms of the electoral arena, that are barriers to democratic contestation, that public financing is only available to parties that are already represented in the parliament, and that all candidates have to pay approximately $28,500 as a deposit before they can run either in parliamentary or presidential elections. And there's been a few cases in which this hasn't been returned. Considering how generally poor people are in Djibouti, this becomes a major constraint for democratic contestation. Now I'm just going to go over a few brief things to give you an idea how electoral competition in Djibouti has changed over time. In 1999, so just after Guelleh came into power, you had elections and they were generally free and fair. You had international observers and generally happy with it. And then in 2003, it was also a generally free and fair election, and this was really highlighted by the fact that the opposition coalition came within 3,000 seats of taking a parliamentary majority and actually, yes, coming into power. But as a result of the unorthodox electoral system that I was talking about before, they didn't actually gain any seats in the parliament. So then in 2005, in the 2005 presidential election, you see a shift away from free and fair elections, and the opposition actually decides to boycott the election. In 2008, President Guelleh issued a presidential decree actually dissolving one of the main opposition parties. So you start to see sort of these authoritarian tendencies coming through. In 2010, President Guelleh amended the constitution in order to abolish term limits, which allowed him to stand for a third term. And then in 2011, it reaches its peak. It's really become quite authoritarian by this stage. You had a lot of anti-government protests that were violently suppressed by the government, and they put a ban on all meetings of the opposition and all further demonstrations. So what you see is a really clear shift away from, like in the late 90s, from free and fair elections. And at that point it was conceivable that the leadership was challenged and could have been overthrown through these elections. But by the time you get to 2011, it's clearly not the case. You're dealing with a different beast, and it's a lot more authoritarian. Okay, to you, Claire.
Okay, so the legislature is the next characteristic. The legislature in Djibouti is known as the National Assembly, and it's been dominated by the RPP since its inception. It's won every single seat in the 65-member assembly since 1992. And so while you have a distribution between the two ethnic groups, so in other words, you'll have some Afar who are members of the RPP, all of the positions of power are ISA dominated. So they control, the important positions like the Ministry of Interior, Minister of Defense, things like that. Furthermore, the legislature has a lot of restrictions on it. It cannot question the national budget. That is the president's role. It does not have the power to refuse presidential appointments or approve them. And it lacks the ability to hold the party, the leading party, and the president accountable. So what this basically does is the legislature essentially acts as a rubber stamp for the president.
So I'm now going to turn things to the judiciary. So you actually have in Djibouti a relatively strong basis for the independence of the judiciary. However, in practice, the judiciary is nearly entirely dependent on the government. You have the ministries of justice and finance who control directly the appointment and promotion of judges, which leaves them very open to bribery and corruption. Also, the judiciary generally ignores constitutional rights, such as the right for people to only be arrested when they have a judicial warrant. Also, you have the government actually coming in and meddling sort of in cases. In the few cases where the judges actually ruled against government interests, you've seen the government come in and replace those judges with judges that are more compliant. So not an arena with much democratic contestation going on.
Okay, next I'm going to talk about the media. While the Djiboutian constitution provides for freedom of speech and freedom of the press, in reality, this doesn't really exist. The government owns the main media outlets, including all the radio and television stations and the major newspapers. It also owns the internet, the only internet service provider. The staff of these institutions are directly employed by the government, so they're government employees, essentially. The reporting of certain types of events, such as corruption and crimes by government officials, has resulted in imprisonment, in exile, or in tremendous fines. And even journalists from foreign-based media outlets have been held by the police and harassed by the government. Poor pay further erodes the independent media, making reporters quite susceptible to taking bribes for writing stories that are favorable to the government. Just to go a little bit into the internet service provider, Djibouti Telecom. The cost of internet service in Djibouti is prohibitively high. It costs about $200 per month. So considering how poor the country is, the people, this is pretty prohibitive. And this service is limited to urban areas. In 2009, only 20,000 people had internet access, which also limits the ability of citizens to access alternate online news sources. There are increasingly sophisticated techniques to get around the barriers, the internet barriers that the government puts up. In April 2012, the group Reporters Without Borders created a mirror site of the foreign-based radio station, the Voice of Djibouti, to help circumvent the government's censorship. But this is quite rare and hard to access. So in all, media, while the Constitution provides for freedom of the press and speech, this is actually not very, it's not transparent at all and quite restricted. And the final one is civil society. Now, civil society plays a really important role in holding governments accountable in general, and in democratic governments, it's very important. In Djibouti, civil society organizations are constrained not only by lack of funding, but by weak technical and institutional capacity. Because there's very limited infrastructure. Societal organizations play very little role in the development of public policy and in holding the government accountable. Only a handful can be considered truly independent of the government, and most of these independent groups are trade unions and human rights organizations. But the government's used a variety of methods to intimidate and suppress these organizations, to include arresting trade union leaders. This happened, there's a high rate of this in April 2006. And the government also systematically targets the Djiboutian League of Human Rights. They've been known to use grenade attacks on their headquarters and have arrested this group's president, his family, and its supporters.
Okay, so just to bring that all together, so what you have a situation where until the early 90s, you have President Abdon and there is really no doubt that he was authoritarian. Then you have a gradual shift in a democratic direction, but never actually really reaching a mature democracy throughout the 90s. During these days, the playing field is still really heavily in favor of the incumbent, tilted in favor of the incumbent. and as a result, it doesn't meet the minimum requirements for a democracy. However, you do in this period see some meaningful democratic contestation coming through the electoral arena, through the media, and through civil society. And so based on this, I think you can really say that the regime was competitive authoritarian in this period. However, from 2006 onwards, you start to see the regime really shift in a more authoritarian direction. They start to crack down on the media, the elections become increasingly non-competitive, and the civil society is increasingly targeted by the government. And by 2011, there's really no doubt that the regime is once more fully authoritarian. Thank you, Claire.
Okay, so the next question, so why is all of this, why did we just talk about all of this stuff? Basically, we want to try to explain why this shift has happened. And one of the reasons we think is that there's a lack of Western censure. So what does this mean? Well, Western nations, and in particular the U.S., have in the past promoted government reform based on the liberal democratic model. So they do this by enacting punitive sanctions, so trying to get governments to be more transparent by enacting sanctions, including the termination of foreign assistance. Likewise, where regimes implement democratic reforms, there are benefits that come to governments from this. In the presence of foreign aid, for example. So why has Djibouti not been subject to international pressure and censure? To understand why, it's necessary to first understand how the U.S. and other Western countries are involved in Djibouti. So first, I think one of the things that comes to mind automatically is the presence of Western military bases in Djibouti. Djibouti, as you saw from the map several slides ago, is in a highly geostrategic location. Geographic extremities of continents, so places that are on the very edge of continents, have an immense strategic value. The country, Djibouti, is located on one of the world's busiest shipping routes. It's at the southern entrance to the Red Sea. It's also a relatively peaceful country with several unstable neighbors that have become hubs of terrorist activity. So this is of interest to a lot of Western nations. Now there's a number of countries that have established military facilities in Djibouti, and this has grown rapidly since 9/11. Following the terrorist attacks in the U.S. in 2001, the U.S. established the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa at Camp Lemonnier, and the objective of this was, the stated objective was to essentially counter terrorism in the region. The base is now also used to launch drones into the region, specifically Somalia, I believe, and Yemen. These bases are a big source of revenue for the Djiboutian government, because the countries that that have military bases, they lease the bases. So, for example, the Djiboutian government gets $38 million a year from the U.S. for Camp Lemonnier. And the U.S., the government has also used this U.S. lease to leverage more rent from other nations. For example, the French lease went up from $20 million a year to $34 million. But the U.S. is not the only military presence in Djibouti. The French, of course, have had a presence since colonial times, and Japan uses it for counter-piracy activities. They have a base there that was opened actually when I was there. The Japanese lease the base for $40 million a year. The Italians are there. and are granted permission to establish a military facility. The German, the Spanish, Dutch are there, and Russian, Chinese, Indian, and Iranian warships use the country as a base as well. And also, so the next involvement that Western countries have is foreign aid. Djibouti receives high levels of foreign assistance. France provides the highest levels of aid as a former colonial regime. But the U.S. is not far behind. In 2010, the U.S. gave the Djiboutian government $6.6 million in foreign aid, 3.3 million of which was earmarked for development assistance. 2.5 of this went to financing the Djiboutian military. So despite these hefty assistance packages, aid has not brought about improvements for the lives of most Djiboutians. About 70% continue to live in poverty with very limited access to health care, welfare, utility services, that kind of thing. Steph?
So there's also been quite a significant amount of non-military investment recently in Djibouti, and a lot of this has been focused around the port and the railway link that links the port to Ethiopia. So since the late 1990s, there's been more than a threefold increase in the amount of import-export traffic going through this port, and a lot of that was on the basis of the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia meant that Djibouti became the main port for servicing Ethiopia. The port is currently run by Dubai World Ports, and the proceeds from the port make up approximately 1/3 of the Djiboutian economy. The port has seen Djibouti really become increasingly important, an increasingly important business partner for the Gulf economies. You've also seen the government increasingly foster trade and investment ties with different countries, including China, Iran, South Sudan, and many others. On the basis of all of this, you've seen a definite increase in the amount of revenue entering the country, but also a diversification of the different countries that are involved in Djibouti. To you, Claire.
Okay, so this presence in Djibouti sort of begs the question in regards to our presentation: how does this contribute to authoritarianism? Basically, what happens, and in the political science literature, a lot of people have written on what happens when a government receives the majority of its income from external sources instead of from its population. So instead of from taxation, for example. What happens is foreign assistance reduces the need for any sort of taxation from the people, which basically means that the government doesn't have to have any social contract or relationship with the population. Instead, the government's concerned about its relationship with donors. So when you have a corrupt system, as you do in Djibouti, and you have a patronage system on the part of elites, this works against developing any sort of strong institutions, because if you had strong institutions of governance, you had a transparent legislature, transparent elections, this would threaten the elites in power. Finally, increased investment in this regime means that there's less money for education and development. So why is this? Well, the government would be threatened by an educated and developed population because that means education development leads to an empowered population, which also would threaten the regime in power.
Okay, so at the beginning of this presentation, we were talking about how the fact that the experience of Djibouti has not been like many other countries, in that you haven't seen Western donors or the US coming in and trying to use carrot and stick measures to promote democratic reform and improved respect for human rights. There's just not really any evidence of that happening in Djibouti, despite a clear awareness of the human rights abuses and the authoritarian shift that's happening. So in this final section, we're really looking at why has there been no censure. And sort of the first thing that's important, we find, is that the US it risks losing a lot of its access to very geostrategically important military bases in Djibouti if it comes out and starts criticizing the regime. Also, the Guelleh regime is in quite a strong position because it knows the importance that the US places on the military base, especially in the current international environment. As a result, it knows that any threat that the US makes to withdraw aid, withdraw support, or withdraw investment is not really a credible threat. To you, Claire. Yep. Sorry, Claire, you're not coming through.
Sorry about that. The other issues to consider when looking ahead is that the West, Western nations, it seems, are maybe content to operate in an environment where you have a repressive regime with little transparency, where the government represses its populace, lacks a free media, where human rights abuses occur, because you know, this basically allows the Djiboutian regime to continue. In the short term, the choice to operate from Djibouti could appear to be a good security policy decision in the war against terror because of its location, but in the long run, the increasing authoritarianism actually could encourage further ethnic tensions and result in increasing instability and violence in the country and in the region. So in the long term, you see that without any sort of criticism of the regime, it actually might negate the kind of stability that Western nations want in the region. So that is the end of our talk, and thank you for listening, and we're happy to take questions.
Great, thank you, Claire and staff. And while our guests are entering their questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, I have a couple that one of them was mine, the other one came in through our email. And again, I encourage you to enter your questions at the bottom of the screen or send them to speakers@culturalknowledge.org. Let me fire one off here to get you going. I know we're talking about Djibouti, but are there similar cases elsewhere in Africa? I mean, everybody watches the news, but what jump out in your minds foremost?
I might jump in on this one. I think, yes, there are some similar cases. Like, I think what you see is merely that the way that the US is involved in countries in Africa has started to shift. From in the early 90s, it was very much about promoting democracy first and foremost. And then you start to see things like covert operations and investments become increasingly important. And maybe even these things become more important than promoting democracy, as I think you see in Djibouti. So in Angola, you have a similar situation where you have quite a repressive government in power, but you don't see any Western censure really of the government. I think Niger is also a really interesting country to look into because there's also a US military base being set up there with covert operations. So I think some of the issues that you see coming up in Djibouti, you see similar issues coming up elsewhere in Africa. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. Claire, did you have anything to add to that?
No, actually, well, one thing, Steph was right on with the countries. We also see similar instances of this in places like Guinea-Bissau, where there's a lot of offshore oil in countries in West Africa, and the need to access this oil sort of negates any sort of censure from Western governments because of the priority that we place on resources. Anyway, so that's and also Steph has written on the Congo, which is sort of an opposite case where the regime has been censured by Western donors, though corruption still sort of exists. But Steph can speak more on that.
Wonderful. I do have another question. You mentioned that with more external support and influences and subsidies, the government and certainly the local governments start losing that social contract. How is the U.S. investment, including that military base, how are those kind of things perceived by the ethnic minorities in Djibouti and surrounding areas?
I'll take this question. Based on, so I, as Jay mentioned in the intros, I lived on the camp for 15 months as an advisor and a researcher working directly with the military. There were a lot of civil affairs folks on the base, and there were specific teams for the different countries, and we had a team for Djibouti City. We also had one that went out into the outskirts of Djibouti, of the country itself. And it's interesting because the Afar, so the least developed areas in the north where the Afar are, and the Afar are the minority, they were the target of a lot of the U.S. assistance, U.S. military civil affairs assistance, helping them with veterinary clinics, inoculations, things like that, helping construct schools. So interestingly enough, a lot of the different groups. Now the Afar are nomads, so they're never, they're very rarely in one place at certain times of the year. But overall, I think the Afar don't mind the U.S. there because they get stuff from us. If that, to put it bluntly, they get aid. We're sort of taking over where the Djiboutian government should actually be filling this role, but they don't. So the military worked directly with USAID in helping the Afar. So interestingly enough, the Afar, it's sort of a satiating effect where our presence actually, in a way, keeps them, I guess, less likely to, develop animosity with the government because they're getting things from us.
Wonderful. There's another question just came in from Dr. Jebjak Berksapi, and I think this one speaks to your thought where the economic and power structures can start moving a country towards or away from insurgency. He says, wondering how much or to what extent is the military sector contributing to Djibouti's economy?
I might just jump in on this at the beginning and then allow Claire to sort of expand on it based on her experiences actually being in the country. But from my understanding of it, you have the military sector, so you have quite a lot of money coming in directly from the rents from all of these military bases. But most of that goes straight to the government, and there's not a lot of oversight over it. So there hasn't been a lot of studies into it, but you get the feeling that there's a lot of corruption going on. There's a lot of money disappearing. You have a population which is still doesn't have enough food, doesn't have access to water, but you have so much money going into this country and a very small population as well. But when you have a look at the service industry that's built up around the military sector, a lot of that tends to be dominated by foreigners, from what I've seen, and it's quite a small group of people who really benefit a lot from that military sector being there. Maybe you can just back that up with, or add your thoughts to that, Claire. Most of my
Sure.
views are based on what I've read, so maybe
Sure.
it's different.
A lot of like Steph said, the economic benefits coming from the rents, these foreign military rents, contribute to the economy of, I would say, the elites. So there was a section of Djibouti city, and most of Djibouti city is very, very, very right by the very fancy French grocery store, where all of the French military families shop, and the elite Djiboutians. There was a section, and there was such a dichotomy between the slums. It was a very, very ritzy section, huge mansions, and most of it, I would say the majority of it, was the folks who lived there were the president's family, government officials, and foreigners. So the economy, you go to Djibouti and there's lots of building going on, but the building is benefiting the elites, those in power, and those with the money, which, foreigners and the ESA sort of patronage network. The other groups do not benefit from it. So, we drove through, and the slums, they don't have, it's sort of like, it reminded me of Kibera in Nairobi, where, you have sewage running down the dirt street. You have, goats running around everywhere, eating garbage. So certain areas are kept clean, certain areas are not, and it's sort of like no man's land. And we were told very, very definitely by the military base officials never to go into the slums because it was not safe. So I guess that sort of answers the question, Dr. Rishepi.
Great, thank you. There's another question that I have, and this probably betrays my ignorance on the whole thing, but Djibouti is labeled a middle-income country. Not knowing a whole lot about it, it's not somewhere where I'm likely to go on vacation. Is it labeled a middle-income country because that's where they took the polling, or is it purely a GDP issue? There seems to be a disconnect. Maybe you can enlighten me on that.
Sure. I can take this question. So actually, it is labeled a middle-income country, and it's based on the GDP. So if you just look at GDP, gross domestic product, I think the last number recorded was about $890 a year, and that's GDP. But if you actually look at the purchasing power, it's half of that. It's about $450. Add to that the fact that Djibouti is extremely expensive, extremely expensive. It's one of the most expensive African countries I've ever been to, probably right up there with South Africa, and South Africa isn't even that bad. So they use the franc, and it's sort of it's tied to the euro, and it's so for example, we would go out to dinner, and it would probably cost about $20 to $30 for a meal at a somewhat okay restaurant. Easily $50 if you go to a really nice restaurant. and that's for one person. So you also have to keep in mind that all of the food is imported because, you know, nothing grows there except, you know, camel. So you can get camel meat that's pretty cheap, but it's not to everybody's taste. So yeah, in reality, it is a very low income country because nobody can, you know, most of the population can't afford to eat out, and can't afford to purchase most things. So.
Okay. Hey, Dr. Rexhapi throws in another question here. What's the state of media and free speech in Djibouti, and what are the implications, as you see them, that this had or will have for democracy in light of the autocratic trend?
I might just jump in at the beginning, and again,
Sure.
You can buff it out, Claire, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the Constitution actually outlines sort of freedom of speech and freedom of the media quite strongly, but as with many things in the Constitution, it's not actually a reality in practice. What you see is there used to be two parts of the media. There was the government-owned media, which is the main media outlets, and that was really very much controlled by the government. An interesting thing is in Djibouti, you don't have journalists who work for this media. They're called reporters as opposed to journalists because they're not considered to be unbiased. They're just reporting what the government wants them to talk about, essentially. But only on very political issues. When it's very political, then there's a government line and most of the media goes with it, or all of the media goes with it. And you've seen a couple of cases where the media hasn't gone with it and they've been very much cracked down on by the government. In the past, you also had an okay independent media, but sort of they were pretty much closed down by the government in 2007, and since then you haven't seen an independent media really, or much freedom of speech or freedom of the media in Djibouti. So the implications that it has for democracy, I guess it's a clear indication of where the regime is headed as well, the extent to which it has cracked down on the media. But taking it from the other perspective, what it means for democracy, I guess it makes things a lot more difficult. I'm not sure how much underground media there is that goes on. Maybe Claire, I don't know if you have any idea of that either. But you do see some things coming through the internet of ways to try and get around it. So there's definitely media trying to push through, but it's a pretty uphill battle from what I see. Claire, have you got anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, just I mentioned in the actual presentation that there have been, because the government controls the main media outlets, they control the one internet service provider, the Djibouti Telecom. There have been groups like Reporters Without Borders that are trying to set up what's called mirror internet websites so that people in Djibouti can access the internet, a free and fair internet. But it's difficult technically, and it's also difficult because most Djiboutians can't afford internet, let alone, you know, basic things like electricity and running water. So there are a few internet cafes in downtown Djibouti City, but you know, it's intermittent. I think we had probably one of the best connections on the base. So, you know, it's the foreigners who get the better connections because we have money for the fast speed, high speed internet. So I guess that sort of is the answer to my answer to the question.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I'd like to take this time and thank you all for contributing your questions and comments. I'd like to take this time, if you would please, to give us any closing thoughts that you might have, whichever one would like to lead off first.
Steph, I can go first, and I can sort of answer The one question that just came up from Mr. Vogelsong, because it kind of sums up a lot of things. I actually don't think there's a risk of decreased Western influence. I think there's increasing Western influence just because of its geostrategic position. I think all of these Western nations are going to stay there. And in fact, Camp Lemonnier, it's being expanded. There was always building when I was there, and it's being expanded even further. So we're going to be leasing even more land. There is a lot of Chinese influence, and I think if the West starts to censure the Djiboutian government, yeah, I think you would see more influence from governments like China and Iran, because they don't they don't have to answer to their population, and they can just they can violate human rights norms and things like that. There's a huge stadium in Djibouti City, the soccer stadium, and that was built by the Chinese. And there are a lot of Chinese, there are a lot of international business people you see at the very fancy and expensive Kempinski Hotel, which is owned by somebody, I think he's from Oman or something like that. But anyway, just to sum up, I think there is a big concern for not in the short term, but increasing instability in Djibouti. In the example that we saw during the Arab Spring, and students actually tried to instigate protests and such like that when it was going on in Egypt and the other countries in northern Africa and the Middle East, but it was quickly shut down by the government. So I think there is a big chance over the long run of tensions just rising. And I don't think it looks good for the U.S. or other Western countries to sort of hold back and not say anything. Steph?
Yeah, I think yeah, you've summed it up quite well, Claire, as the main things I was thinking of as well. I do find it quite astounding, though, like the amount of democratic contestation that still tries to come through, despite how repressive the government has become. The fact that there are so many extreme human rights abuses going on, but that people still go out and protest, and that still occurs. And I think also when you look at it, like, I think it's quite a short-term strategy for the US government and other Western donors to really try and support, and I think they actually really do give support to the authoritarian tendencies of the regime, because in the long term you have these ethnic tensions, you have a lot of stuff going on, and it has the potential to destabilize Djibouti, to destabilize the US role there, their investments, and also to destabilize the region, of course. So yeah, I think these are just things that maybe have to be taken into account. Also, yeah, the reputation of these Western countries, that they're not actually coming out and coming out against human rights abuses and authoritarian tendencies as much anymore. It's just interesting things to think about as well. And that's it for me. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.